Hello again and welcome back to our course on Project 2019. In this section, we're going to take a look at baselines. And put simply, the baseline for a project is basically what we anticipated or what we planned to happen. And hopefully when the project starts and we start measuring our progress on the project, the baseline is what we keep close to. Ideally, we're going to deliver the project according to the use of resources, the timescales, and the cost in our baseline. So the baseline is in fact a snapshot of a project at a specific point in time. So in the case of the wedding, if I decide that I'm now happy with my resource allocation, I'm happy with the cost, I'm happy with the date, and with the sequence in which all of these things are happening, then I can say that that is what I intend to happen. That is going to be my baseline. And from this point onwards, I'm going to measure progress against that baseline. And in many cases, and particularly when it comes to budget, it's really important to know if you're working to schedule or not. So the measuring of progress is really very important, but we measure it against a baseline. Now, I should point out a couple of project management related things about baselines just before we start. One of them is that the use of a baseline is a very good tool for measuring progress against cost, timescales, etc. But it's really important when looking at progress against the baseline that you understand exactly what you're looking at. And let me just give you a quick example of that. So imagine that you've gone to a meeting and somebody there is explaining how the costs on a project are way below budget and they were actually spending a lot less than anticipated, which sounds great, right? Everybody's very impressed. But the reason they were spending less than anticipated was because they were so far behind schedule that they hadn't bought half of the materials required for the project yet. So what they've done is they've taken the bad news and turned it into good news. So you need to be careful to make sure that when you're comparing against a baseline or giving a report on how well the project is progressing, that you're giving a true picture of how well the project is doing. Another thing to point out is that once you've saved your baseline, under normal circumstances, you wouldn't change it. You wouldn't, if you like, move the goalposts for your project. But there can be situations when you will legitimately change a baseline. So for example, you may be working on a project, say this wedding project, and shortly after you've started, the bride and groom decide to make it a completely different sort of wedding. So maybe they decide to hold the wedding overseas or perhaps make it a much larger wedding. And it would be kind of silly to try and measure progress on something completely different against the baseline for the original wedding plan. So in that case, you may need to change the baseline. I'm going to assume for these purposes, generally speaking, that once we've got a baseline, that's it. So let's take this project as it is and save it as a baseline. And what I'd like to do as we're doing this is just to demonstrate what saving or setting a baseline actually does. So I'm going to change the table shown in the Gantt chart here again. And it is worth noting that you don't need to do this to set a baseline, but I'm going to do it on this occasion. So I'm going to go up to View. I'm going to click on the Tables drop down, which we've done before, and I'm going to go to More Tables. And I'm actually going to choose the Baseline table and apply. And what you can see here in the baseline table are the baseline durations of each task, and note that everything is currently 0. And the reason is because this baseline information hasn't been set yet. Until we save a baseline, all of these fields are empty. We have a baseline start date, a baseline finish date, a baseline amount of work, if I just drag that across. We have a baseline cost, predecessors, so on and so forth. So when we set the baseline, all of these fields get filled in. Of course, some of them may still say 0, but things like baseline start and baseline finish will record the start and finish day as they are in this version of the plan. So what I do now is go up to the Project tab, and you'll see that there is a Set Baseline option there. So click on Set Baseline, and it brings up the Set Baseline dialog box. Now, the first thing to point out here is that when you set a baseline, you choose which baseline to set. By default, it's baseline, But in fact, in project, you can have up to 11 baselines. That's baseline and then the 10 alternatives that you can see in the drop-down list. What can happen during the life of a project is that after you've been working on the project for some length of time, there are so many things to change and you get to the point where you need to save a new baseline. But you may want to save the original version of a baseline first. So we're going to stick with baseline. The second option on this dialog is Set Interim Plan. I'm going to tell you more about interim plans in 2 or 3 sections from now, so I want you just to ignore this at the moment. And then you can either set a baseline for the entire project or for selected tasks within the project. Now I'm going to set it for the entire project and I'm going to click on OK. And just take note of what's happened there. Hopefully you weren't too surprised by the fact that very many of the fields in the baseline table were filled in when I set the baseline. Now, one very other important thing to remember about baselines, although setting a baseline involves projects setting up a lot of information, it's also very straightforward to clear a baseline. If you go back to that Set Baseline button and click on the lower half, you'll see you have a Clear Baseline option. And when you click it, it says basically what baseline do you want to clear? And you can click the drop down and you can clear whichever baseline you want. So it's saying, or it's telling me here that I last saved this baseline essentially a few minutes ago as I did. So you can select which baseline you want to clear. Now that's a really useful function if you have multiple different baselines or you're saving different baselines as you go along. I also get the option to clear interim plan as well. Now, as I said, we're going to talk about that in a few sections time, so I'm not going to do that currently. But what I am going to do is I am going to clear this baseline just by selecting it, selecting entire project and clicking OK. And everything goes back to the way it was. Let me just set it again. So we click Set Baseline and Set Baseline again. I'm happy to use the default, which is baseline, and I want it for the entire project. And OK. And now again, I have a baseline. Once the baseline has been set, you have the basis to measure progress on a project. And we're going to be looking at tracking progress a little bit later on in the course. I also need to tell you 1 or 2 other useful things about baselines, but before we do that, I've got a couple of other things to do. First of all, in the next section, I'm going to tell you about the critical path. And then following that, you're going to set the baseline for the bathroom refit project. But at the moment, that's it for this section. Please join me in the next.